I am constantly striving to improve my photography. If I stopped growing as an artist, I don't know that I'd have a reason to continue. For me, the challenge is the goal. So one of my favorite things to do is to challenge myself to go back and make one of my favorite images better. And for this video, I decided to do that using a tool that many of you have been asking me to demonstrate, which is Nik Color Efex Pro. If you don't already own it, be sure to check out the link below for a free trial. And if you do, stick around to learn how to make the most out of the best filters in Nik. Let's get started. Here you can see my previously completed image, which looked great at the time, but we want to push it even further today. But I don't want to get rid of all the work I've done at this point. I've got all these different layers. I've got this smart object here, which especially is just packed with all sorts of stuff. It's got a 5 exposure blend of camera raw smart objects. There's dodging, contrast work, a lot of things inside here. I want to keep all these layers. The way I can do that is to shift click to select all the important layers. I really don't need a vignette. That's kind of a separate thing. It doesn't need to be a part of the filter. I'm going to take all these, right click, and choose to convert to a smart object. And in doing so, my adjustments, my masks, my names, my smart object, everything inside the smart object, all of this will get put into one layer that preserves everything we've done up to this point. And then we can non-destructively apply the Nik Color Efex Pro adjustments to it. So we can not only change the historical edits, but the Nik itself can be adjusted at any time, and it will always update anytime you make any change. So here's my new smart object. With it selected, I'm going to go up to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Efex Pro 4 to invoke the plugin interface. And there's really 3 areas of Nik Color Efex Pro. There's the filters that you choose, there's the settings that you apply for each of those filters, and then of course the preview in the middle. To begin with, let's click on All. This is where you would typically start when you have a fresh installation of Nik, and it's pretty overwhelming. There's a gazillion different options here. Thankfully, Nik gives you a smaller area to play with. So if you're in, say, the wedding industry, you look at the best ones for working on people or portraits, or perhaps, nature, architecture, whatever your thing is. They try to give you a set of collections that narrow things down to what you'd need. What I like to do is look at the all list and then use these stars. Whatever star you turn on becomes a favorite. And then you go to favorites and it just shows those. So this is the list of things that I care about. And it's just really helps narrow things down. So I highly encourage you to create your list of favorites and work from that. Once you have that, you want to pick your starting point. And I'm going to start with tonal contrast, which gives us this default set of adjustments here. What I like about this particular filter is that it lets me change the contrast independently in the highlights, such as the sun here. Watch how that changes in the middle. Or the midtones, which is going to affect the clouds and the water. And that's really what I want to start giving some pop to, is that water. Then there's the shadows, which in this case is not very helpful. You can see it's really going in the deep shadows and the clouds. Don't really like what that's doing. Saturation, of course, is just going to change saturation. I typically don't really play with this too much. And the contrast type, I typically leave all these little drop downs at their default setting. Anything that has text in a drop down, pretty much just ignore it. This stuff down below is common to all the filters, and we'll come back to this later. We don't need it right now. But first, let's just adjust these the way we want. And because the midtones affected the water, that's what we really want. I'm going to go and zero out these other sliders. Now, I can't just double click. If I double click, it goes to its default, which is 25 here. If I double click the midtones, they default to 50. Each slider has its own default. So you just want to click and drag down to 0 to set the zeros. And you don't have to be exactly 0, but just close to it is a pretty smart idea. And I want to take the midtones and dial them in, maybe around like 30, 35% there. Looks pretty good. Of course, you want to compare before and after you make any change. There's a few ways you can do it. We can just turn this specific filter off and on, and you see how nicely that affects the water. Or you can click on this compare button, and that'll just show you all the changes at once. Or even grab this little split preview, and then you can kind of bring that back and forth, or you can even rotate it and go up and down if that's how you want to preview things. So I think this little red preview is helpful. I like to leave it on screen so I have it handy to just quickly show the changes here. Everything's adjusted to the right and everything to the left of it is not. So you can see that quick preview of everything in the image. So now that we've adjusted tonal contrast, I want to go on to the next thing, and I'm going to show you the wrong way of doing this first, then I'll show you the right way. The wrong way is to go over and immediately choose the next thing, which would be Pro Contrast. When I click on it, notice that it just simply replaced what I had. I just lost my filter, it replaced it with a new one. So when I hit Command or Control Z to undo that, now I've got tonal contrast. The right way to do this is click Add Filter. Now you get this blank space to put a new filter. Now go click on Pro Contrast. And see how it's been added here. Tonal contrast is right above it. I can open it up. I can keep changing tonal contrast. It's affecting the image. And I can go down and change pro contrast. So now I get both filters. And what I like about this filter is particularly this dynamic contrast. So tonal contrast was giving us shadow, midtone, highlight, targeting. This one is just looking more specifically at local areas and trying to optimize each. So if I go grab the dynamic contrast and bring that up, you can see how I can add a lot of detail to different parts of the image. What I'd like to do is apply that to the highlights in the water. I don't really want it everywhere. And that's where we're gonna have to start targeting this, because everything we've done so far affects the entire image. I just want to affect the water. So to do that, what I can go down to is these control points. And pretty much all of these filters have these control points with what Nik calls U-point technology. You can click on these to add a control point that either adds or subtracts from the filter. It's basically creating an invisible mask, and I'll show you that in just a sec. But if I click on plus, I can now go and drop one of these points. If I drop it over the sun, notice that the sun area is affected by this filter. I can toggle it off and on. You see that adjustment there in the sun, but it's not affecting other parts of the image. The way that this works is at this center point, it tries to find things like it and set them to this opacity. So the bottom slider here is the opacity. I could turn it off or to full strength. Full strength means give me these adjustments on this pixel and things like it within this radius. So this top slider here is this radius. So as I move it further out, it's going to affect more and more of the image. It's automatically creating a layer mask for us. To take a look at that, we can open up the control points, and you see that you have the control point listed here. If I go and click on this, I get a preview of the underlying mask. So it's taken the center point of the sun, which is the brightest thing, and tried to select it. And then it kind of falls off as you get further away, or you get to things that are not similar. If I were to move this over, say, the water, instead, see how it's grabbing things that are really bright, like the central part of this within this radius. So as I bring the radius smaller, you can see how it's targeting to a smaller and smaller area. So if I want to just affect the water in this image, then I want to be placing my control point over the water like this, and you see how it falls off on the areas around it. So maybe I just dial it in a little bit like this. I wouldn't worry about this mask too much. It's kind of hard to reason out what's going to happen, but it's helpful to take a look at it once in a while and understand where things are being affected from a quality control perspective or just from a learning perspective. So let's turn that off and look at the image, and now take a look at before and after, and you see how that's helping us adjust the water there and give it some nice pop, as well as bleeding into the sky, which I like. So I'm going to leave that alone. But if I wanted to knock some of these areas out in other parts of the image, maybe I don't want to affect this cloud here, I could grab a negative control point, go drop it up here, and now it's being removed from the mask. And if we again click on this to look at the mask, you can see wherever this one is, it's trying to negate that thing within its radius. And it's really just applying this opacity. So if I put the opacity in the middle, it's going to try and make everything kind of a middle gray. If I go to 100%, it's going to try and make everything 100%. So I can, add, or I can subtract, or I can just kind of go in the middle. That's whatever I need. I really don't need this control point. So I'm going to click on it and just hit the delete key to remove it. But that's how these control points work. Now they work against a default for the entire canvas. So the default right now is showing this opacity of 0%, meaning that anything that isn't affected by this control point, the default is 0. If I set this opacity up to 100%, then the default is 100%. And then this locally here is trying to set everything to 100%. So everything I'm doing, both the control point and the opacity are saying 100%. So it's just really applying the whole image as is. So you don't want to do that, but just important to know that that's kind of the default control for everything. That's what the opacity is really all about. So we'll click on this, take a look at this, and just make sure it didn't screw anything up. Just looking before and after. I like what that's done. Lastly, within this filter here, we have a couple of other options. There's correct contrast. I don't usually use it, and you'll see if I increase it how it tends to go insane, but a little bit can be helpful. So maybe, from 10 there, just a little bit is helpful. And then this correct color cast. And you see I have a bit of a magenta cast in my water. If I bring this up, you see how it starts to remove that color cast from, no adjustment to full adjustment there, how it's trying to clean that up. I don't want to remove it entirely, but maybe I'll just kind of go about halfway or so, like 30, 40%, to try and start improving that water, because when I originally processed it, I just got too aggressive with the white balance and the waves were just honestly too magenta. But we'll fix it later in completion. I'm just going to do a little bit right now, and then I'll do a little bit more with a filter later on. Let's go click Add Filter. And the next thing I want to do is keep adding to the glow of the sun here. So we've got the water looking pretty nice. Now I want to work on the sun area. And a great way to do that oftentimes is this glamor glow. When you click it, you got a few different options. And just like you think as you increase the glow, that's really the primary thing you adjust. And what it does is it gives you kind of a soft glow in the highlights and pushes everything else pretty dark. You notice that the shadows and highlights here are automatically adjusted. And if you bring up the shadows, it's trying to kind of protect the shadows from being adjusted too much or protect the highlights from being adjusted too much. This is one of the few filters where, the non-zero values are helpful. For the most part, I don't adjust these, but in this particular filter, you might say, you know what, let's kind of protect some of these shadows so we don't lose the detail here. But I don't want to apply this globally. Again, I want to hit the sun areas more with this particular filter. So I'm going to click for a positive control point, but I want to show you something here. Let's open up the control points and notice that the default opacity is 100%. So everything right now is 100% getting these slider values. I could set it down to 0 and you see nothing, or something in the middle get part of it, but it's defaulting to 100% with no control points. If I add a positive control point, the moment I click on the canvas, watch what happens when I click on the sun. Nik set the opacity down to 0 because, again, a positive control point on a canvas that's already fully adjusted has no value at all. It knows that if you're trying to isolate just this area, it ought to hide everything else for you by default. So it's just making that one little change for you. But now we've got the glow in the areas around the sun, and we can see it from before and after that bit of glow. And I'd like to extend it more into other parts of the sky here, because right now I'm targeting just the brightest parts of that sky and not necessarily the darker ones next to it. So if I hold down Alt or Option, now I can click and drag and it gives me another control point with the exact same values, same radius, same opacity. And this is a way of giving myself more width to this. So instead of making this one with a really big radius that affects the whole image, I can take these and go a little bit wider with them. So it's letting me start to go and make a mask that isn't quite so circular in its nature. And now we've got this adjustment targeting the sky here. And maybe I just go and grab one more of these to try and get those little missing bits of the sun there. And the mask was kind of gray around it. That's looking a lot better. Now we can look from before to after and see how that's enhancing the sunset there. But it's too much. We're really into kind of fantasy land. So I need to drop back the glow here, maybe 30% or so. See how it just nicely gives it a glow, not too much, just a little bit to really draw the viewer's attention to this part of the sky that doesn't have a visible sun, but we can just make it pop a little bit more. I don't usually adjust the saturation here, but the glow warmth is nice. If you bring that to the right, you're adding more kind of warm yellow white balance. If I push it all the way, you see how it gets really yellow. And if I bring it back to its center point, you lose that. So right in the middle here, I think nicely warms up the sky. So I think this one is good. Let's go click Add Filter, grab the next one, which I'm going to grab the Skylight filter. And this one is just beautifully simple. There's one slider option, and the further you take it to the right, the more it just goes crazy on sky colors, and it's super easy to overdo this one. A little bit goes a long way. I'm going to dial it back to maybe about 10, 15%, just like before and after. See how that adds some nice warmth to the sky? Even that's too much. I think around 10% here is more ideal. I like what that's doing. And you can see kind of the cumulative effect of all these things together. It's really nicely improved the sky there. I don't need to add a control point because this one is by default really kind of targeting those warmer tones. It looks great as is. So I'm just going to click Add Filter and go on to the last one, which is I still have some magenta cast in the water that to me is a bit too strong. So I'm going to go grab the white neutralizer, which is a great way to adjust the white balance after the fact. See everything went a little bit blue. What we want to do is pick a target color. So click on the picker, and then I'm going to go down and click on my water here to make that the target for adjustment. And it needs just a second to analyze the image, and then it's trying to neutralize that particular color cast. And you have two different controls. Adjust whole image is really saying, how much can it adjust around it, in terms of like its reach from this area. And then the neutralize is, you know, how strongly it tries to correct it. So this is, you know, kind of what to adjust, and this is really how much. So as I bring up the neutralize whites here, you can see it's really starting to just suck all the color out of this part of the image. But if I brought up the whole image, it would increasingly let me get more and more into the sky. And it's not a desaturation. It really is trying to neutralize a color cast. So it's a little bit more intelligent than simply just desaturating. So let's back this off and find the right slider values. And I think the neutralize, I don't need quite as much. The adjust whole image, trying to get that reach about right. And this is definitely one to look before and after to make sure you're not overdoing it. See how it's reaching into the sky and a bunch of other areas. I like what it's doing for the water. Maybe not quite so much, but it's getting in the sky too much. So I'm going to click to add a control point, and again, drop it in the water here, and kind of just, you know, hold down Alt or Option and make multiple different adjustments so I can try and, oops. You can actually select multiple points at once if you click and drag around, and then you can go and adjust the sliders on all of them at once. That's what that's about there. So, but just trying to make sure I mask this water in appropriately, and see how that adjustment there, I don't really need that. So I kind of like how it's tailing off in color there, and maybe even get rid of this one. Let this adjust further down here. See how that looks, and we'll look before and after. And when you have all these control points, there's not a great way to hide them other than to go to a different filter. And now you can kind of look before and after without seeing them in the way. And see how nicely that adjusted, and that white neutralizer, if I click before and after, you see how that removes that color, and it's still getting up into the sky. So in this case, I am going to go and add a negative control point and go drop it up in the sky, make it nice and big here, maybe make a couple of copies of it to help protect the sky a little bit better. And now it's better protecting these areas, maybe even bring one down into the warmer tones here, because it is affecting some of that as well. And that's now much more hitting the area that I wanted to. We can see the before and after now is starting to really target things. But I do think it's a bit heavy-handed. I still want to retain some of that color. So I'm going to take the neutralized whites amount down a bit here. And just look before and after. And maybe even take down that adjust whole image. So these are kind of a little tricky to set. You got to play with things. It's not super clear cut exactly how they interact, so we got to play with both. But that looks really good. So I think there's one last thing I want to play with outside of Nik, but we've got the Nik adjusted. So I'm going to click OK to apply my smart filter. So you can see we've got the filter here for Color Efex Pro is represented down below, and we have a smart filter mask. What I'd like to do is see what happens if I just target the highlights and don't adjust the shadows as much. So I can click on this, and in Lumenzia, I'm going to click L for a lights preview, drag it to L1. So it's going to be biased to the highlights here, maybe even just as a bit further. Grab the gray point here and bring this across. So it's going to affect the whole image, but these shadow areas are going to be less affected. I'm going to click on my filter mask to make that the target, click on mask, and Lumens is asking, do I want to create a new layer mask or adjust the filter mask? I'm going to say filter mask. And so this will output here with that new adjustment. And if I shift click, we can see before when it's affecting everything versus after, how it's a little bit more targeted there. And in this case, I actually do want to keep the original. So I'm just going to delete that. But sometimes that can be a really helpful thing to help target things by luminosity. And now let's just compare the original to where we are now. So if I go click on the before button, here's where we started. And then after all the Nik Color Efex adjustments, we got to here. We could double click this at any time and change the Nik Color Efex Pro settings for all of those sliders, or double click the smart object itself and get back to the original layers and change any of them. Now click to this next video. We can learn more about how you can use luminosity masks with any third-party software like Nik or Luminar.